Every man gets defeated twice. Once by his enemy, once by his own reaction to losing. Marcus Aurelius commanded legions across the Roman Empire, and he said the second defeat is the only one that matters. Here's why most men never see it coming. You lose the deal. The relationship ends. The project collapses. That's the first defeat. External, tactical, survivable. But then something else happens. You start explaining it to yourself. You build a narrative. You create meaning where there was only circumstance. And that's when the real damage begins. Aurelius wrote in Meditations that we suffer more in imagination than in reality. He wasn't being poetic. He was describing the exact mechanism that destroys men after failure. You take an event, a single data point, and you transform it into evidence of something larger. You weren't just rejected. You're unworthy. You didn't just lose. You're a loser. The story you tell yourself after the loss becomes the cage you live in. And most men never realize they built it themselves. This wasn't theoretical for Aurelius. He faced the Antonine Plague, Germanic invasions, betrayal from his own generals. External defeat was constant. But he understood something that separates men who rebuild from men who collapse. Defeat is not what happens to you. It's what you allow it to mean. That shift, from event to interpretation, is where control still exists, and it's where most men surrender, without a fight. Aurelius had a framework. He called it separating the obstacle from the judgment about the obstacle. Simple language, brutal precision. Here's what it looks like in practice. You get passed over for the promotion, and that's the obstacle, concrete, finite, but your mind doesn't stop there. It starts adding layers. They don't respect me. I'll never advance here. I should have gone to a different company 5 years ago. Each layer takes you further from reality and deeper into a story you're manufacturing in real time. The obstacle hasn't changed, but you've compounded it with interpretations that have nothing to do with what actually happened. Aurelius trained himself to strip away those layers immediately. Not to feel better, to see clearly. He'd write, "This thing, what is it in itself?" Force the mind back to the raw fact. No embellishment, no narrative, just the thing as it exists. Because once you separate the event from the story, you can act on the event. But if you fuse them together, you're fighting phantoms. Seneca put it differently. He said we're more often frightened than hurt, and we suffer more in imagination than reality. Same concept. The Stoics weren't three separate philosophers saying three separate things. They were diagnosing the same psychological trap from different angles. The trap of letting your interpretation become your reality. And once you're in that trap, the external defeat doesn't matter anymore. You've defeated yourself. Modern men do this hourly. A text goes unanswered. Instead of waiting for information, they construct an entire narrative about what it means. Disrespect, disinterest, rejection. They've compounded one piece of missing data into a full psychological crisis. The Stoics would have called that voluntary suffering. You're adding weight to something that has no weight yet. And by the time you get the actual information, you've already been living in the worst version of the story for hours. That's the first defeat you can avoid. Stop interpreting before you have facts. Stop building meaning into silence. The event is the event. Everything else is you choosing to suffer in advance. Aurelius did something that sounds insane to modern ears. He rehearsed disaster daily, not because he was pessimistic, because he understood that the thing you haven't imagined will destroy you when it arrives. He called it Premeditatio Malorum, the premeditation of evils. Every morning, before the demands of empire, he'd mentally walk through everything that could go wrong. Betrayal, loss, death, humiliation, not to drown in anxiety, to remove the shock. Shock is what breaks men, not the loss itself. The fact that they never considered it possible. They built their entire psychological structure on an assumption of permanence. The relationship will last, the job is secure, the health will hold, and when the assumption collapses, so does everything built on it. Aurelius avoided that by assuming nothing was permanent. He'd write reminders. You could leave life right now. Not morbid, clarifying. If you accept that everything is temporary, you can't be ambushed by its ending. Epictetus, who was Aurelius's philosophical predecessor, taught this more bluntly. He said, "When you kiss your child goodnight, remind yourself they are mortal." That sounds cruel until you understand the function. You're not wishing for tragedy. You're removing the illusion that you're owed permanence. Because that illusion is what creates the unbearable suffering when loss comes. The man who says, "This should never have happened," is suffering from a broken expectation, not just from the loss itself. The man who says, "Nothing lasts forever," is suffering only from the loss. And that's survivable. Here's the modern version. You're building a business. It's going well. Revenue is up. Team is solid. You've stopped considering failure. That's when you're most vulnerable. Not because failure is more likely, but because you've lost the mental rehearsal that would let you handle it. Aurelius would have spent time each week imagining the business collapsing, not to manifest it, to prepare the mind for a reality where it happens, and you still have to keep moving. The man who rehearses disaster isn't destroyed by it when it arrives. He's already been there in his mind. The shock is gone. And shock is the thing that freezes you. This isn't pessimism, it's inoculation. You expose yourself to the idea of loss in small controlled doses so that when real loss arrives, your system doesn't shut down. The Stoics treated the mind like a muscle. You don't build strength by avoiding weight. You build it by rehearsing the heaviest loads in advance. And the heaviest psychological load is the thing you've convinced yourself can never happen. That's the second defeat you avoid, the one that comes from being blindsided by a reality you refused to consider. Here's where most men lose themselves completely. They fixate on what they can't control and neglect what they can. Aurelius divided reality into two categories: things within your control, things outside it. And he was ruthless about the line: your thoughts, your reactions, your principles, your effort. That's the first category. Everything else is the second. Other people's opinions, outcomes, circumstances, the past, the future, all of it outside your sphere of influence. And the Stoic position is simple. Pour all your energy into the first category. Accept the second as it comes. Sounds basic. But watch how men actually operate. They'll spend hours obsessing over whether someone respects them. That's category 2, outside your control. Or they'll replay a conversation from last week, trying to mentally revise it. Category 2, already happened. Or they'll build elaborate anxiety about a future that hasn't arrived yet. Category 2, doesn't exist. And while they're burning energy on phantoms, they're ignoring the one thing that's actually in their hands: how they're showing up right now. The defeat here isn't losing the respect or making the mistake. The defeat is abandoning your control to chase after things that were never yours to control in the first place. Aurelius would say, you're volunteering for slavery. You've handed your peace, your focus, your power to external variables that don't care about you and won't change because you're worried about them. That's a chosen defeat, and it's the most common one. But here's the part that's harder to accept. Even your goals are partly outside your control. You can control the training, not the outcome of the fight. You can control the pitch, not the decision. The Stoics weren't saying, don't have goals. They were saying, don't attach your worth to results you can't guarantee. Attach it to the process, the effort, the integrity of your actions. Because that's the only thing you'll carry with you, regardless of outcome. Modern men struggle with this because they've been sold a different model. They've been told that if they work hard enough, success is guaranteed. And when it doesn't come, they break. Not because they failed, because they believed in a transaction that doesn't exist. Effort doesn't guarantee results. It guarantees that you did your part. The rest is outside the line. And trying to control what's outside the line is how you lose your mind. This is why Aurelius could lose battles and not lose himself. The battle's outcome was category 2. His conduct during the battle was category 1. As long as he controlled what was his to control, the external result couldn't defeat him internally. He'd done his part. The universe did the rest. And he didn't confuse the two. That's the third defeat you avoid. The one where you let external outcomes determine your internal state. The Stoics called that enslavement. And once you're enslaved to things outside your control, you're defeated before the fight even begins. Here's the twist. Aurelius didn't just accept defeat. He transformed it into fuel. There's a concept in Stoicism called amor fati, love of fate, not tolerance, not resignation. Actual love for whatever happens, including the worst moments. Nietzsche would later expand this idea, but the Stoics practiced it first. The idea is simple and psychologically radical. What if the obstacle is the path? What if the thing you're trying to avoid is exactly the thing that builds you? Aurelius faced a plague that killed millions. He could have seen it as cosmic injustice. Instead, he treated it as the context in which his leadership mattered most. The crisis wasn't interrupting his life. It was his life. And his response to it would define whether he lived as a philosopher or just talked like one. He wrote, "The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way." That's not motivational fluff. That's a complete reframing of adversity. Most men see defeat as deviation, something that pulled them off course. The Stoics saw it as the course. You wanted to build resilience? Here's the resistance. You wanted to develop patience? Here's the delay. You wanted to test your principles? Here's the situation that will reveal whether you actually have them. The defeat isn't the interruption, it's the curriculum. And the men who recognize that don't just survive adversity. They're forged by it. This is why Aurelius could say some of the most powerful things ever written while watching his empire struggle. He wasn't writing from a place of comfort. He was writing from the middle of chaos. And the chaos gave the words weight. If he'd written Meditations during peacetime, it would have been theory. He wrote it during war, plague, and betrayal. And that's why it still cuts 1,800 years later. The philosophy wasn't abstract. It was survival. Here's how that applies now. You lose the job. You can see it as a setback, or you can ask what it's teaching you. Maybe it's showing you that you were too dependent on external validation. Maybe it's forcing you to develop a skill you've been avoiding. Maybe it's clearing space for something you couldn't have pursued while comfortable. The amor fati approach doesn't deny the pain. It looks for the function. What is this defeat building in me that success never could? That's not toxic positivity. That's refusing to waste the experience. The Stoics believed nothing happens to you, only for you. Not because the universe loves you, because you're capable of extracting value from any situation if you choose to. The defeat becomes a defeat only if you let it stay a defeat. If you metabolize it into insight, discipline, or strength, it was never a defeat at all. It was raw material. And that's the shift that separates men who rebuild from men who stay broken. The broken men see defeat as the end of the story. The rebuilt men see it as the beginning of a different chapter. Same event, different interpretation, and interpretation is the only thing you actually control. Aurelius died in 180 AD, probably from the plague he spent years fighting. He never saw Rome stabilize. He never saw his son, Commodus, become the tyrant that would unravel much of what he built. By external metrics, his ending was tragic. But here's what matters. He didn't die defeated. He wrote in his final entries that he'd done his duty. He'd lived according to nature. He'd controlled what was his to control. The rest was indifferent. Not good, not bad, just indifferent. And because he separated his worth from external outcomes, the collapse happening around him couldn't touch the integrity happening within him. He lost the empire, but he never lost himself. That's the guide. You will be defeated externally. That's guaranteed. Markets shift, people leave, bodies break, plans fail. None of that is negotiable. But the second defeat, the internal one, is optional. You choose that. You choose it every time you fuse the event with a story that disempowers you. Every time you fixate on what you can't control. Every time you refuse to extract value from adversity. The Stoics weren't teaching you how to avoid defeat. They were teaching you how to remain undefeated while losing everything. And that's a different skill entirely. One that most men never develop because they spend their lives trying to avoid the losses instead of preparing for them. So here's the question Aurelius would leave you with. When the defeat comes, and it will, who do you become? Do you collapse into the story you tell yourself about what it means? Or do you strip it down to the facts, control what's yours, and build something from what remains? The answer to that question is the only thing that determines whether you were defeated or not. Everything else is just noise.